Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are here with Steve Schmidt, Senior Vice President, Public Policy and Communications with the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association.
Hey Steve, how you doing? Great that
Oh,
you're taking the time here today to be with me. We have a long history together, so it's really quite a privilege to be with you as you've evolved in your own career. So I want to start today with just a little bit of a background of who you are and how you got to be where you are.
yeah, it's such a pleasure, Jim. We do have a long background and through many different iterations, both for you and my career. But my career has been one that's been spent entirely in the field related to beverage alcohol. The beginning of my career was with the local prosecutor's office. Then I moved on to a state nonprofit that focused on supporting prosecutors and other criminal justice professionals and dealing with impaired offenders and others that had involvement with alcohol and other substances. Then I moved on to the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board, where I had the opportunity to build their area of social responsibility and community outreach, prevention, in trying to be a player in reducing harm from beverage alcohol and certainly assisting their system in being able to address those issues. And then in the last 15 years, I've been with the National Alcohol Beverage Control Association. We represent all of the controlled jurisdictions in the United States, of which there are 18. My primary role is public policy, communications, a lot of partnership relations, overseeing research for the control system and understanding what makes them tick, as well as helping people understand what and who they are, because they are a different type of regulation than exists in the other 33 states, which are what we refer to as licensed states. So there's a lot of information you want to get into people's hands, but it's also given me a great opportunity to be involved in the kind of policy discussions that we're going to have today at both the state, national, and international level.
Now, prior to COVID, I know there was a lot of shifts and changes in the whole alcohol regulatory world, and it had to do a lot with demographics, economics, and also just changes in lifestyles. But what would you see were the principal changes prior to COVID? And then we'll get into what you've seen since.
Well, there were, I think there were a few different drivers of a lot of the regulatory change that we were seeing prior to COVID. And when I say prior, really for a couple of decades. And certainly in the decade previous to COVID, a great deal of change. The first thing is, I think, technology and the ease and the use of technology to make beverage alcohol purchases and interacting with on and off premise locations easier, more convenient for individuals. I'm not talking about just delivery. I'm really talking about the entire consumer experience. Secondly, there was a real rise in local craft producers in the United States. Some would argue that that really started with the wine industry many decades ago. They truly were a local craft type of industry, very localized. And that moved to the breweries, a real opportunity for them to create local products, innovative products. And more recently, it's been distilleries. And I bring that up because the craft or local producers were driving change, first of all, to be able to help them with the innovation that they were looking to create. Secondly, how people would be able to access their products. Primarily, it was occurring at their actual premise of development, premise of manufacture. We saw a real rise in the creation of, early on it was wineries, but then it's craft brewers, now craft distillers. And that really put a lot of pressure on the regulatory systems, often to make changes to the system that helped the local producers. The change, some was positive, some was negative, because change, even though it was for a local producer, can have an impact on change for larger industrial producers around the country. And it really was causing a lot of challenges for regulators. The last thing I'd say about the craft producers is that it gave rise to a lot of different types of locations and establishments. Places that started out as tasting rooms now became full-blown restaurants, bars, and even large entertainment venues. And these were really, again, pushing the boundaries of what regulation could do to make sure they were operating like all the other producers. Then lastly, I just think the rise of Alco-tourism around the country that was really framed around these local producers. And then the other thing that I'd say, we talked a little bit about, being able to be more convenient for consumers. We talked about technology. We've talked about craft producers. And then I want to lump this last group, and I think this is going to be very interesting to your group. And that is that we were seeing an explosion of the different types of places that wanted to serve beverage alcohol. Everything from movie theaters to nail salons to large outside venues to even these large hospitality and neighborhood zones or hospitality zones, as you certainly are familiar. So I just think there was a lot of opportunities for social interaction around these locations, and all of these things end up requiring unique regulatory provisions that may not have existed before. So we were seeing a lot of change due to those reasons.
As you're talking about it, it seems almost as if it's getting to a point where alcohol will be just so available everywhere that it almost becomes not something that people focus in on in terms of some of their decision making about where they want to go. But I know that you have a prevention perspective as well. And with COVID, there was also even an accelerated rate of modifications to rules and regulations for alcohol delivery, to take out where you could buy mixed drinks when you order your food, or where you have expanded outdoor dining, where you take over the parking areas, and then you have the crossover from the existing licensed establishments to a seating configuration in parking areas. So the alcohol has to be transferred through the public space, which typically is against regulations. But also you have the issues around seating and occupancy capacity and hours of operation. So COVID, it seems to have, from my perspective, created this whole firestorm of not only alcohol regulatory changes, but engagements by health departments in ways that they had never been before, fire departments in terms of being involved. So how do you see COVID influencing just even increased availability of alcohol, as well as the way in which city, county, and state agencies have had to learn to set priorities and work together?
Well, first of all, the issue of whether or not consumption increased and what that looked like, I don't think we'll know that for a few years yet. There's certainly a lot of research going on in that area. So I typically don't make too many judgments of how drinking changed. I think it's obvious that much more consumption during the height of the pandemic occurred off premise than it did on premise, but it's difficult to know what that impact is going to be. But there are those much smarter than I am that are going to be looking at that. As to the other players in regulation, because I think there are, sometimes people think of alcohol regulation as just those that are sitting in the alcohol beverage control authorities. And no doubt they are the most involved in how alcohol is regulated. But when it comes to on-premise, you're right. You're absolutely right. Fire and health was playing a larger role. Although I would argue that even before that, you saw where there was especially the type of the type of hospitality that spread over multiple locations. You saw a little bit more from health and fire, but health and fire has always been active. Now, with that said, generally speaking, that occurred, most of their involvement occurred before the license was provided. They would go in, inspect the premise, make sure there wasn't, there weren't any fire hazards, that certainly health inspectors would go in occasionally to check on food, but it was up to the alcohol regulators to really be in there and make sure they were following up on the procedures that they required for their license. And if they saw a fire or health hazard, they may pull in those other players. But as we began to, I think, push out regulation to the local communities in the height of the pandemic, they became more involved as experts, especially those in the health community, where there were government orders on certain restrictions. But it ended up, what I think is really interesting, while there was that engagement and there was more involvement from health departments and fire departments, especially health, as I mentioned, alcohol regulators around the country ended up being sometimes called the COVID police, because they were the state agency that was often asked to go in and check on these different provisions, whether it was distancing provisions, whether it was seating provisions, whether it was how curbside delivery was going. There were a lot of things that were done in order to help premise be more responsible, but it was often the state regulatory compliance units that were asked to check on that. And the reason primarily for that is we tracked a lot of this across the country, was that a lot of this was being done by state government order. And these state agencies are under the governor's jurisdiction. So it was certainly it was easy to get them up to speed, and they certainly were more capable of getting out. They had relationships with the licensees. So where alcohol was being sold, it was often the alcohol regulator that was in many ways the COVID police for those kinds of restrictions.
Moving forward, you've already talked a little bit about the whole craft beverage industry and how it was changing the approach to alcohol policy. And clear, you have this reconfiguration where perhaps now local authorities are more in tune with the state alcohol regulations than they may have paid attention to before. So there's been an educational process along that way. And then moving forward, there's going to be a way in which this kind of interagency collaborative may be seen as a real positive outcome of COVID that could be more permanent and more formalized. And this is perhaps part of the movement around creating an office of nighttime management with a dedicated night management staff. I know I just spoke with Ariel, who's the director of the Office of Nightlife in New York City, and they have an interagency team that meets weekly, not only looking around public safety with policing and code compliance, but also some of the more emerging racial justice and diversity issues, so that you have this ongoing communication among the key agencies to be proactive and anticipatory rather than just being responsive. So 18 months from now, how would you see COVID changing the whole dynamics of not just the alcohol regulatory world, but how the community works with hospitality businesses? Because that was also one of the outcomes, is the businesses themselves got better organized and they created their own best practices and standards. How do you see, 18 months from now, the whole social economy in the on-premise sector, and how it will change and how it will be the role of the interagency collaboration that might lead to more productive and preventive strategies?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you used the word community, because I think you're correct in your premise that while it was occurring previous to COVID, no question that we saw, whether it was local licensee organizations or maybe a local government got involved, we saw community efforts from licensee and hospitality communities in wanting to better their cities and wanting to make sure that they provided options in their neighborhoods. So we had something I think that community had something to build on already. But what COVID did do is I think it did shine a light on how cooperation could be a strong, really a strong player in building these cooperative efforts, making sure that you were, whether it's sharing resources from those that are experts in how you set up an outside dining area, to making sure that you had consistent and uniform communication with the local government organization, so that you were able to put forth a united front with the alcohol regulators. That really important is to have learned from each other. How are we going to make customers safer? How are we going to do this in a way that meets the, also meets the not only consumer demands, but our neighborhood demands, for public health and safety, and the safety of the general community. So I think COVID, and by the way, I think this occurred in many different industries, but I'm not sure there's a better example than the hospitality industry and the beverage alcohol industry in general, where they came together, they shared resources, they shared best practices, they shared ways of being able to communicate with key regulatory and government agencies. So to me, this is an exciting time that if I were sitting in a local government chief executive's office, and I thought that hospitality was going to be an important part of economic development, this is an exciting time. And there are leaders out there, you've mentioned a couple of them previously, Jim, that I think are going to help lead the way. And what I'm excited about is I see a desire on the part of alcohol regulators and others to work with them, not give them a pass, but to work with them to make sure that the rules and the regulations are met, that we keep people safe, keep employees safe. So I think you may be moving into an era that is going to really be defined by a lot more cooperation. As to how people socialize, certainly people have spent a lot more time at home than they have in the past, but I think people are still going to want to socialize, and they'll figure out ways to take these new opportunities for whether it's access to their favorite product or their favorite recipes, and take those and combine that with what might be another exciting part of their socialization, which will be these different zones and these different opportunities the communities give them.
Well, great. This has been very informative, Steve. I'm glad we had the time to talk. And I wish you luck in all your future endeavors. And I look forward to collaborating again in the future.
Sure do. Look forward to seeing you sometime in person soon, Jim, and be well.
Okay, thanks.